if we don't have these conversations, unconsciously or consciously, or sometimes even on purpose or with little intent, the message that the other person receives is, I don't care about you. I want to avoid your bid. I'm not interested in your interests. I've got more important things on my mind. I'm too busy to pay attention to your bid, and your bid is not worthy of my time, and I want to be more independent than you want me to be. So just notice that, like, when you are constantly turning away from the bids that maybe your partner, your friend is offering you, that is the way they perceive it. And so if you are the person who is feeling these, like you're being turned away, when you believe the thought that the other person doesn't care about you, like, what is the feeling, right? It could be feeling rejection. It could be feeling shame. What would you be doing if you're believing that the other person doesn't care about you? You're certainly not making more attempts to have a closer relationship. In fact, you start to kind of give yourself space and drift away from that relationship. So it's so important for us to notice, when the bids that we are receiving and giving, if we're turning away or we're being turned away, how do we feel? And is that helping us strengthen that relationship? Hey mama, welcome to episode number 67. Today we are going to be talking about strengthening relationships, and I am going to be talking about some of the work that I have been diving into and get us making some serious decisions about how we want to strengthen our relationships. So whether you're thinking about strengthening your friendship or your marriage, your relationship with your children, your workplace relationships, this episode is for you. So let's get started. Are you ready? Hey mama, you deserve a life free of overwhelm and burnout. Welcome to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. I'm your host, life and mindset coach, Shiro Bergbauer. I'm also a wife, mom, and CRNA. This is the podcast for high-achieving mamas in medicine like you and I. Together, we'll learn how to navigate the ups and downs of working motherhood. If you're looking to thrive in your relationships and overcome overwhelm in your motherhood, marriage, and medicine, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. Today, what we're going to talk about is the idea of bids for connection, and this is based on John Gottman's work. If you are new here, you may not know that I love John Gottman's work in the Institute because he and his researchers have really done a lot of relationships research. And so most of the information he shares is science-based and pretty deep science too. So today we're going to talk about what bids are. We're going to talk about how we make bids for connection happen and how we decide how to bid, and maybe some of the ways in which our bids are, taken, and what we can do to improve the way we bid, because that is, I believe, a foundation for strengthening our relationships. And then next week on the podcast, we are going to talk about investing in relationships. So we're going to go from strengthening and deciding on how we're going to bid, and then we're going to dig deep into how to make those investments, how to do it. So it's going to be a 2-part series on the same topic, and it might actually extend into a 3rd part because this was such deep work, and it's work that I'm also doing with some of my coaching clients who are working on their marriages, and we're seeing a lot of breakthroughs, and so I'm excited to share this with you guys. So I want to say that I reference a lot of books in my podcast, and this podcast episode, as far as bids are concerned and strengthening relationships, it's actually multiple books that I have kind of dug into, and I'm trying to set up a foundation for just basics of relationships. So I will link the books that I reference in the show notes, just so you know, if you're interested in reading them, you can go ahead and find them on Amazon. I will say, and I always say this disclaimer, I don't recommend that you go buy 5 books and you try to read all 5. I recommend you buy one book and you try to implement a few things from that book before moving on to the next book. So, just a little housekeeping conversation and let's get started. I want to say the books that I'm going to reference primarily, they're, again, John Gottman books, but I'm going to reference some work also by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller, who wrote the book Attached. I'm going to reference John Gottman's work. And the 2 books that I really were used to kind of prepare for this episode is The Relationship Cure and The 7 Principles in Making Marriage Work. So if you are a person who wants to go find all those books, please feel free to check out my Amazon bookstore. Those books are all on there. I do always make the disclaimer that those are affiliate links. And so my Amazon storefront is a commission-based storefront. So if you purchase through my links on there, I do make a small commission at no cost to you, but it's Amazon's way of getting people who have some sort of following to bring them to Amazon to shop. So the other book that I did reference, and I'm not sure if I even used it in the show notes, but the other book is Wired for Love by Stan Tatkin. It's almost like a tongue twister. And Wired for Love, the subtitle is How Understanding Your Partner's Brain and Attachment Style Can Help You Diffuse Conflict and Build a Secure Relationship. So those are the books. They will be in the show notes. So don't feel like you have to buy all of them, but if one of them resonates with you, just read the subtitle, the information on the books and go from there. So before I get started, I'm going to start with a quote from John Gottman. And this quote, when I read it the first time, I was like, this is so true. And so John Gottman says, most people don't get married, have children, make friends, or take jobs with the intention of allowing these relationships to fail. And yet, that's what often happens, simply because people don't pay enough attention to the emotional needs of others. They're not acting mindlessly because they want to be mean. They're just temporarily caught up in their own concerns and not focusing on the people around them. But if you don't pay attention, you don't connect. And if you don't connect, you wind up operating on the principle that your partner, your friend, or your coworker is not going to be there for you. That, in turn, starts a cascade of negative interactions, including criticism, defensiveness, attacking, and withdrawing, all of which eventually destroy the relationship. Being mindful, on the other hand, leads to the formation of stable, satisfying relationships. When you're mindful, you notice other people's bids and you respond to them. Which leads me to the next thing. What is a bid? A bid for connection. It can be a question, a gesture, a look, a touch, any single expression that says to the other person, I want to feel connected to you. A response to a bid is just that. It's a positive or negative answer to someone's request for emotional connection. One of the things that John Gottman says is whatever conflicts couples may have, whether it's sex, money, housework, kids, all of them long for evidence that their spouses understand and care about what they're feeling. Sharing such information through words and behavior is essential for improving any significant relationship. This includes bonds with our kids, our siblings, our friends, our coworkers. But even the best efforts to connect can be jeopardized as a result of one basic problem: failure to master the bid, the fundamental unit of emotional connection. So, bids can be, and their responses can be big, overblown, cathartic events such as those that we see in the movie. So one of the ones that came to mind was in the scene in the Titanic where Jack is like, will you marry me? So that's a bid for connection. Sometimes it's in the movies, like if you are a rom-com kind of person or you like sappy movies, where the girl's running across Manhattan to tell the love of her life that she can't live life without him. Those are kind of like the overblown, big ones. Or they can be the small, mundane exchanges of everyday life. So some of the bids I think about is like when my daughter says, Mama, will you play dress up with me? Or my husband will say, Honey, do you want to go to Costco with me? So those are just like tiny bids. Now, bids can be verbal or nonverbal. So they can also be highly physical or come totally from the intellect. They can be sexual or non-sexual. They can be high energy or low energy. They can be funny or dead serious. And they may include questions, statements, or comments. And their context usually involves thoughts, feelings, observations, opinions, and invitations. So, like, I was just thinking about this, like, when my husband said to me the other day, hey, I think we should look at the budget to just kind of see where our money leaks are. And so it's an invitation, but it also included some thoughts in it. So this past week, my daughter had they had a book fair at their school. And because of the nature of my job and my husband's job, it's usually very difficult for us to do drop off and pick up because of the hours we work. And so our nanny usually manages drop off and pick up. So on Thursday, I had told my nanny in kind of in secret, I said, hey, I may try to go to the book fair tomorrow afternoon. So I'll give you a call and let you know if I can do pickup. And so, but I asked her not to mention it to my daughter because I honestly didn't know if I could make it and I didn't want to get her all excited and then not show up. So it worked out. I got off work early and I went to the book fair. And funny enough, all the books had literally been bought. And there were a few Spanish books, so I bought some Spanish books. And they had told us, like, once you come to the book fair, because it was around pickup time, if you come to the book fair, just ask them and they'll go get your kid. And so the librarian went to get my daughter. And when she brought her, she told her, your mommy's here to pick you up. And my daughter goes, my real mommy? Because she's not used to me picking her up. But it was such a beautiful moment. I got to like see some of her artwork on the walls at school and like, kind of say hello to people that know her. It was kind of awkward because they're like, oh, you're Bella's mommy. But it was also beautiful because like everybody I met had just such kind things to say about my daughter and how kind she is. And it was definitely a parent pride. But for me, that bid, even though I didn't communicate it ahead of time, I really did want to connect with my daughter and do drop off. So the part of the bid that was actually funny was, again, my daughter and my nanny have their own little routine and they do drop off and they go to this indoor playground. I had a couple of coaching calls later in the evening. And so my daughter said to me, hey, we should go to We Rock the Spectrum, which is where she likes to go play indoors. And I was like, I'm so sorry, I can't go. And that like felt so bad for me. And I realized that she was making this bid for connection that not that I didn't want to do it, I just couldn't do it. And that turning moment for me was to take that bid and let her know I couldn't do it, but really like acknowledge that I understood that she was bidding to connect with me. Some bids are nonverbal, right? They can be affectionate, like include affectionate touching, like a backslap, a handshake, a pat, a squeeze, a kiss, a hug, or a back or shoulder rub. Facial expressions such as a smile, blowing a kiss, rolling your eyes, or sticking your tongue out. Playfully touching such as tickling, bopping, wrestling, dancing, or a gentle bump or shove. And when I think about this, like, the more I started reading about bids, I started to like really pay attention to the bids that my husband and I connect with each other, my friends and I make bids with each other, my daughter and I and the way our family like bids with each other. So they can also be affiliating gestures such as opening a door, offering the person a place to sit, handing over a utensil, or pointing to a shared activity of interest, vocalizing such as laughing, chuckling, grunting, sighing, or grooming in a way that invites interaction or interest. Now, when there are positive responses to a bid, it usually leads to continued interaction because then both parties start to extend more bids to each other. But if there is a negative response to a bid, it may shut down emotional communication and like the bids cease. So in my bid between my daughter and I, when I couldn't literally, I was like, I really cannot do this. Like there was a tantrum that it was involved and we did come to a negotiation when we came home. We did some artwork together and that worked out. But I did notice that then once I told her I couldn't do the thing that she was asking of me, she kind of shut down. And shut down can look like, again, like the tantrum. It can be, if you're looking at a bid between you and your spouse, it can be that they no longer ask for something because they've been shut down. When we think about bids, they typically grow in intensity and frequency as a relationship grows and deepens. So if you evaluate relationship encounters, you would see how each of those is made of like little exchanges. There's a bid and then we respond to it. And just like building blocks of a relationship or cells in a body, they continue to be the primarily necessary building block of emotional communication. And each exchange in a bid contains emotional information that can strengthen or weaken connections between us. So one of the things to think about is when people react positively to our bids, they have greater access to expressions of humor, affection, and interest during arguments. Because what we notice is like a relationship bank. And once you've accumulated all those positive feelings because you've responded respectfully and lovingly to one another, it literally is like an emotional bank account. So when there's conflict, you can withdraw from that relationship bank account because there's a reservoir of good feeling. So it's like, what John Gottman says is like, it can be, you're thinking about like, I may be as mad as hell at this person right now, but this is a person who listens so attentively when I complain about my job, so I should cut him a break. Or I'm so angry with my partner, but she's the one who always laughs at my jokes, so I'll cut her some slack. So just notice the way we respond to each other's bids. So what happens, though, when we habitually fail to respond positively to another person's bid for emotional connection? It's not that it's malicious or mean-spirited. It rarely is, right? But when we continually do that, we've kind of just become unaware or insensitive to the other person's bids. But when it becomes habitual, the results are devastating. So it doesn't matter if we're not doing it out of malice or not because we don't care. But if we continue to go in that direction, the relationship starts to disintegrate. So the other thing, what John Gottman and his researchers found is that people who have trouble with the bidding process also have more conflict. And this is conflict that might be prevented if they could just simply acknowledge another person's emotional needs. So when we think about bids, we also can think about arguing. And one of the things about arguments is that they come from misunderstandings and feelings of separation that might have been avoided if we could have just had conversations that we needed to have. So, but because we don't have those conversations, we didn't have these conversations, we argue instead. And one of the things about arguing is that these conflicts can cause marital discord, divorce, parenting problems, and family feuds. Friendships fade and deteriorate, or in our relationships with our adult siblings, those relationships can also wither. What is important for us to notice, and this is not passing judgment because it's just something for us to take in, is that children who are raised in homes that are filled with chronic conflict, they have more difficulty learning, getting along with friends, and staying healthy. And people who can't connect are also more likely to suffer isolation as well as dissatisfaction and instability in their work lives. Any of these problems can create a tremendous amount of stress in our lives, and that can cause all sorts of physical and mental health problems. So just important for us to notice how that pans out. So one of the things to realize is that complex, fulfilling relationships don't just appear out of the blues. We actually, and they're not fully formed. We actually have to develop them one encounter at a time. So what's most important for us to first think about when we think about bidding is how do we respond to each other's bids? And there are 3 ways in which we do that. The first one is turning toward. The second one is turning against. And the third one is turning away. And what I want to offer you is to start noticing in your own life, your own bids for connection and your partner's bids for connection, your friends' bids for connection, your children's bids for connection, and start to notice in which of these ways are you responding. So turning towards a person when they bid, it means that we react in a positive manner to their bids for connection. When we turn towards a bid, it helps the bidder feel good about themselves, and they feel good about the interaction we're having. When we turn against each other, the way that some of this is described is like being belligerent or argumentative. So turning against often includes also being sarcastic or ridiculing the other person. And what John Gottman and his research has found is that this pattern of hostility followed by suppression of feelings, like if somebody is like argumentative or like just sarcastic or ridicules you, most of the time we will suppress our feelings. But what happens is, if that is what follows the bid being turned against, this is very destructive to relationships. And again, just remember, people rarely intend to be malicious or mean-spirited when they turn away. They're just operating on autopilot, and they're unaware of how their behavior is affecting those around them. Now, turning away usually involves ignoring another person's bid or acting preoccupied. So if you think about like when kids are playing together and one kid says, hey, let's play, I'm going to be the mommy and you're going to be the daddy. And the other kid goes, hey, I'm going to be the robber. So it's almost like they're not really like engaging in the game. They're just coming up with a brand new game. The child whose bid has been turned away may kind of feel isolated. So the problem is when we are constantly turning away from another person's bids, we may leave our partner feeling like they're just being neglected, right? And partners who display the pattern of interaction in which they were turning away, John Gottman and his researchers actually had like a love lab where they put these people in an apartment and they could watch them and see how they interacted. What they found was these people who displayed that pattern of interaction, they often became hostile and defensive with one another, particularly when they discussed an area of continuing disagreement. What happened is that they noted that this behavior will usually result in early divorce amongst married couple because they're not solving conflict. They're just like turning away from each other. Now, the other thing that they notice is that the reason people might turn away from bids consciously or unconsciously is because they want to gain more autonomy in their relationships. And so in those cases, the person turning away is trying to regulate the balance between freedom and interdependence, which is an important task in any relationship, including relationship between friends, family members, or coworkers. One of the most important things that John Gottman pointed out is that if you find yourself in a relationship where either one of you is regularly turning away, you need to look carefully at your intentions. If both of you are committed to having a close relationship, then you can take steps towards becoming more aware of each other's needs so you can turn towards each other more often. But if you feel that either one of you is turning away in order to gain more autonomy in the relationship, then having the conversation about the relative needs for independence is necessary. And so if you avoid this discussion, though, hurt feelings will result and eventually the relationship will dissolve. A couple of episodes back, I talked about like when friendships end. And one of the things that I noticed in this particular instance that I described is the reason why like things were dissolving is because there was no discussion about like the independence and autonomy that was being asked of each other. One of the things to notice is that if we don't have these conversations, unconsciously or consciously, or sometimes even on purpose or with little intent, the message that the other person receives is, I don't care about you. I want to avoid your bid. I'm not interested in your interests. I've got more important things on my mind. I'm too busy to pay attention to your bid, and your bid is not worthy of my time, and I want to be more independent than you want me to be. So just notice that, like when you are constantly turning away from the bids that maybe your partner, your friend is offering you, that is the way they perceive it. And so if you are the person who is feeling these like you're being turned away, imagine feeling that the person who you are thinking that the person who you are in a relationship with is saying, I don't care about you. And what does, like, when you believe the thought that the other person doesn't care about you, like, what is the feeling, right? It could be feeling rejection. It could be feeling shame, disappointed. What would you be doing if you're believing that the other person doesn't care about you? You're certainly not making more attempts to have a closer relationship. In fact, you start to like kind of give yourself space and drift away from that relationship. So it's so important for us to notice like when the bids that we are receiving and giving, if we're turning away or we're being turned away, how do we feel? And is that helping us strengthen that relationship? The other thing is, again, going back to like if you feel your bids are being turned against, you may experience feelings of loneliness, isolation, and rejection. And what John Gottman says is like, and I'm going to just kind of disclose something here. It's just the emotions of a child who's told, you can't play on our team and we don't want you and you're no good at this. So a while back, my daughter had an interaction where one of her friends told her that she couldn't, they were playing in a slide and her friend told her, no Bella allowed here. And my poor baby cried and cried and cried. She was just gutted. She just felt like she was being isolated and rejected. And when I thought about that, which was actually coincidentally around the time that I was grieving the end of the relationship that I brought about, I was thinking about the fact that like we all have that emotional inner child who feels that way when our bids are ignored or dismissed. And so we may feel distressed, right? Like when we feel like we're being rejected. And what can happen is that we become hypervigilant or overly sensitive to insult. So if somebody turns against us and then maybe they say, oh, you don't even know what you're doing, we could be like overly sensitive and have like such a visceral reaction to criticism or being insulted, or just like be hypervigilant, like just feel like we always have to be on the defense, right? So what happens if our bids are unrequited? So which means that we're bidding and the other person habitually we're turning towards we're turning bids, right? But then they're not turning towards our bids. So we're bidding and they don't return our bids, but when they bid, we return to their bids. What happens is that this pattern can be so destructive to our relationship because the more our bids are ignored or rejected, we will give up trying to connect in the same way again. It's just human nature, right? We all want to belong. We all want to be loved. We all want to be part of something. And if that continuously, kind of feels like rejection, right? We're not likely to continue bidding. So one of the things, again, in this John Gottman's book, he says, whatever conflicts we have as couples, whether they're sex, money, housework, or kids, we're just looking for evidence that our partners care about us, right? So when we are bidding and that bid is turned against, we're starting to believe our partners don't care about us, right? So if we can think about that, we can notice like when our bids are unrequited, like how do we then show up in our relationship? So how do we decide how we can bid? There's so many factors that determine how we bid and why we decide to bid the way we do. One of them is like factors that are related to the way our brains process feelings. And that is just like the way we are basically naturally wired. When we are making bids for emotional connection, we're usually seeking to satisfy one of three emotional needs, which are common to all people. That is because we as human beings want three things: to be included, to have a sense of control over our lives, and to be liked. So if you think about it, like when we do things, even when we tend to like veer into people pleasing, it's because we want to like belong and we want to be liked. So the way we decide to bid is because we want to feel one of those three things. When all those things are met, we experience feelings of well-being and a sense of purpose to our lives. Now, remember, connecting is not magic. It's something that we can learn, practice, and master. So when we think about the way we make bids and we have a natural desire to connect with other people, then we can basically show up and be open to creating bids and open to receiving bids. When we think about people who make playful bids and turn towards one another enthusiastically during everyday conversations, those people have more access to humor later on when they get into an argument. Just going back to like that emotional bank, like when we can turn towards the people who bid with us and we have some sort of like, gentle receptiveness, we actually can have access to that when we are maybe in a season of arguing or a season of like struggle. We can tap into that. So one of the things about bidding is that there is an ask of us to be vulnerable, right? So we can think about like when we are asking somebody for something or we're trying to bid to connect, we're being vulnerable. We are saying, hey, I have these 3 needs. I want to be included. I want to have a sense of control over my life, and I want you to like me. So there is an element of that like creates that environment for us to show up and ask to bid. Now, sometimes though, we may start making fuzzy bids because we don't want to feel vulnerable. So we can start to dance around issues because we want to avoid emotional risk. How do we do that? We can do that by making ambiguous bids on purpose to avoid vulnerability or emotional risk. So that can be like unintentionally poor communication, such as using inexplicit language, forming bids in negative ways that are hard for others to hear or accept, and failing to acknowledge our own needs at any given time. So if you think about how we show up and ask for our needs to be met, if we start to kind of like separate ourselves and not show up in the power of I am putting my heart out, basically, I am putting my heart on the table, and you do what you think is most important to, create that for me, it can be a little uncomfortable, right? Because we're saying, hey, let me give you my heart. Like, can you take care of it for me? Like, is this going to help us? Is it going to, like, are you going to turn towards me, or are you going to turn away, or are you going to avoid me? So just notice those things and start to notice, like, when we openly bid for connection, right, we have to notice the people we ask those connections for and be okay with them being our vulnerability vault, like knowing that we can trust our emotions with them, that they're not going to, hurt us or maybe be unfair to us. And especially like when we think about the way kids bid with us, right, like they are literally saying, hey, I want this from you, but I don't really have, like, I don't know exactly how to name it. I want you to figure it out for me. And so if we don't show up and allow them to be vulnerable with us, it can cause a breakdown. And I think many of us, like, one of our intentions is to show up for our children and to have them know that we can show up for them reliably. Talking about like how we choose to respond to bids, just notice for yourself in your own life right now, how are you responding to the bids from your partner, your friends? Are you turning towards them? Are you turning away, or are you just avoiding them? Like, ask yourself, like, what is the way you're choosing to turn towards those bids? And the scope of turning towards bids can be very broad, and it can be sometimes like nearly passive responses, like a 1 or 2 word comment or mild shift in behavior with no verbal response. It could be low energy responses sometimes, like, when you're like, oh, honey, do you like my outfit? And they're like, oh, sure. It could also be attentive responses, which involve opinions, thoughts, and feelings. And then it could be high energy responses, which involve full attention with good eye contact and just like excitement from the person who is receiving it. When we turn towards a bid, it helps us feel good. It helps the person who is bidding feel good about themselves and about the interaction we're having, because then they welcome more interaction, and that leads to more bids. Again, being a building block, it's like if they bid and we turn towards them, then they can bid more. We can bid. They can accept our bids. And I just want us to notice in the coming days, like, how are people bidding for our attention and how are we responding to them? Because if we're not turning towards them, then are we turning away from them? And again, turning away is what happens when we fail to pay attention to another person's bid for attention. And it can occur in one of 3 ways. It can be a preoccupied response, in which we often, like, we're involved in an activity. Let's say your husband's watching TV and you come up to him and you say, hey, honey, do you want to eat dinner? And they just like continue staring at the TV and they don't respond. Or, your husband comes home and he like gives you a hug and you push him away and you continue to cook dinner. So it can look like that. Or it can be a disregarding response in which you just completely ignore or you focus on insignificant details. So like, let's say your husband comes home and says, hey, honey, we need to talk about the budget. And you just like go quiet. Or you ask your kid, this happens to in many families, like, what do you want for dinner? Do you want grilled cheese sandwich or soup? And then they're playing on their video game and they just like don't say anything. Or it could be an interrupting response in which the other person introduces an unrelated matter or a counterbid. Like, for example, you say to your husband, like, hey, honey, do you want to work on such and such? And then your husband goes, oh my gosh, look at all the mess in the sink. And it could be vice versa, where they like just totally bring up another conversation. So remember, like when people are turning away from our bids, they're really just operating on autopilot. And sometimes like rarely are they being malicious or mean-spirited. And I think one of the things to just notice for ourselves is when we experience these bids, are we showing up thinking that they're out to get us, or are we willing to be curious and compassionate? Like, I wonder why that person would react that way they did. Because, again, either way, like maybe they didn't mean to be, disregarding of our bids, and maybe it's something that we can talk about. Maybe it's something that we can express. Hey, when I brought this and this up in the conversation, how did that react, right? The other thing is turning against bids. So when somebody chooses to turn away bids, it can be in different ways. It could be a contemptuous response, like just like hurtful, disrespectful comments aimed at the person bidding for connection. And it's like almost sometimes like delivered with an air of superiority, like I want to have distance between you and me. Or like, so the example that they used was so hilarious. I shouldn't laugh. But it was like the husband says, hey, do you want to go have some lunch? And the wife is like, is that all you ever think about, eating? Yeah, so it was... Or it could be a belligerent response that's like provocative or combative, where like you just know the person's looking for a fight. Uh, Like the person says, hey, would you get me a napkin while you're up? And the person says, go get it yourself. Or the other one was the husband says, hey, do you want to go watch TV? Do you want to watch TV tonight? And the wife goes, so that's all you think I'm good for, right? Sitting in front of the tube watching mindless TV shows all the time. Just like noticing. And then the other one can be a contradictory response in which you seem intent in starting a debate or an argument. And it's less hostile than a belligerent response, but it still blocks the attempt. So like this one was like, the person says, would you like a tangerine? And the person goes, that's not a tangerine. It's a Sastuma orange. Sorry, I had to laugh because I wrote some of these down and I was like, that's just funny. Or it can be a domineering response that involves attempts to control another person. So basically, you're just like trying to get over the person. So like this one was the person says, hey, do you know where I'd love to go someday? India. And the other person goes, don't be ridiculous. You would hate it there with all its poverty and overcrowding. Scandinavia, now that's a place you'd really love. Like just very dismissive of the other person's like attempt to bid and even what they're interested in. And then there could be critical responses that are broad-based attacks on the other person's character. And these are different from a complaint. It's like when you start saying like, oh, you always and you never. And I remember like when I was going through therapy for postpartum depression, like one of the things that my therapist shared with me is like when you notice saying to your partner like you never or you always, just notice. So this one was like, the person says something and the child goes, hey, can we pull over soon? I've got to use the bathroom. And the dad goes, why don't you ever go before we leave the house? Like you never learn, do you? The other one is defensive responses that create a sense of separation by allowing the speaker to relinquish responsibility for matters at hand. So it's like your husband comes home and tells you they had a hard day, and then you're like, oh, well, you think your day was bad. Well, what about mine? Like, you think I had a fun day? So, like, basically just being defensive, even though the person's just, like, trying to share their aspect of the day. So my challenge for you is to start, like, creating an emotional log as to how, like, just the way you're showing up with your bids. And what you want to answer for yourself is, like, what did you notice in the day about the way you made bids for connection with the people who matter to you? And then what did you feel about the way they responded to the bids? Like, Did you notice that anybody turned towards you? Did you notice that somebody turned away from you, turns against you? And what did that behavior look like? And I will include, I think there's a PDF for that. I will include it in the show notes if I can find it. It's going to help you maybe just kind of see your own log. The other one is there's an exercise from John Gottman's book, and I'll share a PDF of it. And it's just to notice what your style of bidding is and how you respond to bids. Again, it's not for you to critique yourself or, be hard on yourself. It's just to start to notice, like, as we go towards learning how to show up in our relationships and how we want the people who we are in relationship with to notice our bids for connection. Like, how do we connect? How do we bid? How do we receive the bids? And is there something about that we want to change, right? Because the first part of change is awareness. So if you don't have awareness about how you show up and how you bid, then it's very difficult for you to decide how you want to show up in the future. So that is like going to give you the foundation of how you want to start strengthening your relationships. And it will set the stage for next week, where we're going to talk about how to invest ourselves in our relationships. And we're going to talk about our bids for connection. And then we're going to talk about ways in which we may impede our bids and the bids that are given to us so that we can make choices. So we're going to talk about the 5-step process of really working towards strengthening and investing in strengthening our relationships. So we're going to talk about, how to look at the bids for connection. We're going to talk about how to discover how your brain emotional command system works. We're going to talk about examining your emotional heritage. And we're also going to talk about sharpening your emotional communication skills. And then the last thing which is the 5 steps, and the fifth step in the 5 steps is how to find shared meaning. And then we're going to kind of talk a little bit about how to apply what we learned in the series. Again, the series may extend into 3 episodes just depending on the length of the conversation. So I hope that you enjoyed just this insight on how to strengthen our relationships by noticing the basic building blocks of our emotional connection, which is our bids for connection. We also talked about the different ways in which bids are received. And we talked about just some little things to notice about our own relationships and how maybe we can start showing up differently with awareness of other people's bids to connect with us. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm so excited because it's work that, again, I've done and I'm still doing, and work that many of my clients are working on, and we're seeing such amazing changes. And so I want to invite you to start considering doing some of this work in your own relationships, whether it's your marriage, whether it's your friendships, whether it's your relationship with your adult siblings, whether it's relationship with coworkers, just to start to notice how are you bidding for connection and how do you want to do it differently or improve it so that you can strengthen the relationships that you already have. That is all I have for today. I will speak to you next week when we talk about investing in our relationships. So have a great rest of your week, Mama. You're amazing. You can do hard things. And I'll see you next week. Bye now. I'm Shira Bergbauer, and you've been listening to the Stethoscopes to Swaddles podcast. New episodes are out every Monday. These episodes are created by me, Shira Bergbauer, and produced by Cassidy Mitchell. If you enjoyed this show or found it helpful, please rate it and review us on Apple Podcasts. If the concepts I share on this podcast resonate with you, or you're ready to change your relationships and mindset, I can help you. If you'd like in-depth, personalized support, I'd love to invite you to apply for my Life and Mindset coaching program. Just imagine you and I every week working together as I teach you the tools to up-level your life. To book your free 1-hour consultation call, go to www.stethoscopestoswaddles.com/consultation. You're doing a great job, Mama. Have a great week. Bye now.